Hello, my name is Joshua Fox, and this research is to be presented at the UW Research Symposium. With that being said, is drug use and addiction a moral failing? I'll be exploring this topic with you today, and I feel this would best be done by exploring different influences on societal views of drugs and people who use drugs. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll be exploring different religions and questioning whether each religion has contributed to societal views of drugs, people who use drugs, and addiction, as well as how each religion has done so. The three different religions I'll be touching on are Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity. I'll provide background information on each religion as well as a timeline for events that may have had an effect on societal views. And I'll be starting with Buddhism. According to metmuseum.org, Siddhartha Gautama was born in 563 BC. He grew up in a sumptuous palace surrounded by every comfort. At the age of 29, Gautama snuck out of the palace and decided to abandon his luxurious and lavish lifestyle in an attempt to conquer the innate appetites for food, sex, and comfort. 6 years later, Gautama achieved this enlightenment and became a Buddha, which means enlightened one. Gautama spent the next 45 years walking around northeastern India spreading his teachings. Gautama's teachings became the foundation for what would develop into Buddhism, and Gautama is the human figure that would later be known as the Buddha. Next, we have the core beliefs, foundations, and values of Buddhism. Groves with MDPI Journals says that Buddhism primarily addresses the human mind. As we saw earlier, Buddha sought solutions to his cravings. Through seeking these solutions and reaching enlightenment, the following teachings and techniques were developed. The first is the Four Noble Truths. Groves describes the Four Noble Truths as follows. First is the truth of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. The second is the truth of the cause of suffering, known as craving. The third is the truth of the end of suffering, also referred to as enlightenment. And the fourth is the truth of the path leading to the end of suffering. Next, there is a threefold path, which is said to be the foundation of Buddhist practice. The threefold path is ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Finally, we have mindfulness, which Groves describes as central to the practice of Buddhism. Mindfulness refers to paying attention to experience in the present moment and has connotations of recollecting one's self. Mindfulness is understanding the data that is collected through paying attention to the present experience. It is particularly the understanding that each situation is temporary. This is said to give rise to wisdom, which is one of the characteristics of the threefold path. Now that we have a simple understanding of Buddhism's foundation and its core beliefs, let's explore how addiction was approached in early Buddhism. Groves states that Buddha strongly encouraged his followers to avoid addictive substances and behaviors by drawing attention to their unwanted consequences. After Buddha's followers attained enlightenment like he did, he encouraged others to teach the order and customs, including avoiding addicting substances and behaviors, out of compassion and for the benefit of others. Additionally, some of Buddha's techniques that he made to help others with addictive behaviors can be described as being similar to modern behavioral techniques. After briefly exploring how addiction was treated in early Buddhism, I think it's important to see how addiction has been treated in established Buddhist cultures, such as Thailand and Japan. It's also important to see how some of those core beliefs and values have carried over into the 20th and 21st centuries. Groves references Thailand's response to the growing heroin epidemic in the late 1970s. A program was developed at the Thram Krabak monastery where 500 individuals who used heroin and opium attended treatment for 10 to 28 days. This treatment involved herbal medicines, taking a vow, meditation, chanting, Buddhist teachings, and work as well. A follow-up was done 6 months after the treatment, and about 25% of the people who used heroin were found to be abstinent at 6 months post-treatment, while About 66 of the people who smoked opium were found to be abstinent at 6 months post-treatment. In Japan, a system for introspection called NICAN was created in the 1940s. This system is based on the following 3 questions. Number 1, what have I received from X? X being one's loved ones, such as one's mother or friends. 2, what have I given X? And 3, what trouble have I caused X? The question, what trouble has X caused me, is ignored, since one is usually aware of the questions or is aware of the answer to this question, and reflecting on it is seen as unhelpful. Groves states that the system has come to be seen as a Japanese form of psychotherapy. And in fact, as a psychotherapy, NICAN has been used to treat alcoholism and other forms of addiction since the 1960s. A follow-up study was conducted on 129 patients struggling with alcoholism who were treated with NICAN. The study found a 53% abstinence rate from alcohol at 6 months and 49% abstinence at 1 year. One final influence of Buddhism can be seen in modern mental health, behavioral health, and recovery fields. Groves notes that mindfulness has been adapted for use in relapse prevention and addiction recovery. A 2009 study showed that this modality had a high patient satisfaction, and 50 to 80% of patients continued to practice mindfulness after their program was finished. Mindfulness is also a component of dialectical behavioral therapy that has been adapted for use with people who use drugs or people with addiction. This modality also has cognitive and behavioral aspects, which one could argue are foundations of Buddhism. Dialectical behavioral therapy adapted for addiction has had promising results in initial trials. Additionally, acceptance and commitment therapy is another therapeutic modality that has influences of mindfulness. So, in conclusion, Groves notes that Buddha was aware of the consequences associated with addiction and addictive behaviors. His main focus, however, was helping people to attain enlightenment as he had done, which is characterized by wisdom and compassion. The response of the Tham Krabak Monastery in Thailand to the heroin epidemic can be seen as a continuation of this compassionate activity. Similarly, in Japan, NICAN also appears to have a compassionate response in its works with people suffering from alcoholism. Additionally, the strong presence of mindfulness in many therapeutic modalities seems to be a continuation of the core values of meditation and wisdom. Because of the compassion for addiction seen in early Buddhism and the continuation of Buddhist values seen in established Buddhist cultures, one could argue that Buddhism has contributed to positive societal views of addiction and people who use drugs. Next on the list is Judaism. And I feel the best way to see past and present views of drugs and addiction in the Jewish community is by starting with mentions of drugs and addiction in the Bible and in Jewish law. In the Bible, we specifically see Noah's drunkenness in Genesis, and the condemnatory attitude regarding Ham's apparent role in causing this drunkenness. Lowenthal, with MDPI journals, notes that subsequent Jewish laws can be seen. Examples include discouraging excessive alcohol consumption, the prescription of alcohol consumption for religious reasons, as well as praising wine in moderation, and the very rare occasion of drunkenness. So overall, it seems Judaism supports the controlled use of alcohol. Though the Bible does not mention the use of other substances such as opium, Jewish and rabbinic laws were said to emerge alongside the development of substance use in countries with Jewish communities, as well as alongside the subsequent outlawing of many drugs in these countries. For context, current rabbinic opinions center on 2 fundamental Jewish laws. Number 1, that life and health must be protected and the saving of life prioritized. And number 2, that Jews should obey the laws of the country they live in, where these laws do not conflict with Jewish laws. Moving forward, there seems to be a significant shift in community views after historical events in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Lowenthal notes that during this time, German and Russian medical writings with anti-Semitic tone constructed drug addiction as a social problem relating to modernity, capitalism, and Jewishness. Jewish scientists attempted to respond to these allegations, addressing the issue of addiction, constructing projects for social change, also for improving Jewish health, and generally trying to reshape Jewish identity in the wake of these writings. Lowenthal states the overall effects were the marginalization and repression of people who use drugs and people struggling with addiction. Lowenthal also claims that anti-Semitism and the Jewish scientific response played an important role in developing current policies towards drug addiction, in spite of the lack of effectiveness of these policies. When attempting to identify the prevalence of alcohol use, substance use, and addiction in the Jewish community, Lowenthal states that there are particular difficulties in discovering prevalence, denial being described as chief among these difficulties. One example of this denial is seen in 1962 when it was reported that alcoholism and drug addiction were entirely absent among the Jewish community in the US. In fact, it wasn't until the 1970s when awareness of Jewish alcoholism in the US began to develop. However, support groups of the 1980s found it near impossible to book their activities in synagogue premises. There was continued denial of the existence of addiction in the Jewish community and fears that the use of synagogues for addiction support groups would damage the reputation of the synagogues. It's also worth mentioning that Lowenthal notes, in 1995 there was a reported zero prevalence of alcoholism among the UK Jewish community. This denial stretched beyond synagogues and into the beliefs and attitudes of the Jewish community. Lowenthal provides several quotes and beliefs that showcase the high levels of denial and stigmatization in the Jewish community. One member of the community was quoted saying, "People can't know I'm struggling." Another member, talking about community support services, is quoted saying, "I wonder what type of families need this. Is it just those who can't cope? I might feel ashamed to ask for such help." A coordinator of a Jewish community support group was quoted saying, "One problem is stigma and the related problem of confidentiality. In a small, closed community like this, these are difficult issues." In fact, this quote showcases an important feature of stigmatization in the Jewish community. Lowenthal states that addiction is believed to affect the chances of all family members gaining admittance to the more prestigious religious educational institutions, the marriageability of family members, and possibly employability in some religious communal roles. And so, as made clear by Jewish contributions to scientific and legislative responses to the German and Russian writings of the 19th and 20th century, as well as high levels of denial among community members about the prevalence of alcoholism and addiction in the Jewish community. In general, addiction seems to be highly stigmatized in the Jewish community. The final religion on my list is Christianity. And because a brief summary of the presence of drunkenness and substance use in the Bible was provided while exploring the views of the Jewish community, this section will start by exploring the views of Christian individuals and Christian organizations starting in the late 1800s. As noted by authors of Drugs, Society and Behavior, Hart and Kaiser, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, known as the WCTU, was organized in 1874. The WCTU, alongside the National Prohibition Party, were driving forces in the second wave of statewide prohibition in the US, which happened from 1880 to 1889. In 1899, after several states had repealed their prohibition laws, saloons started to gain popularity among a group of educators, lawyers, and clergymen. Sermons from the time adopted language similar to that from the following sentiment: "The liquor traffic is the most fiendish, corrupt, and hell-soaking institution that ever crawled out of the slime of the eternal pit. It is the open sore of this land. It takes the kind, loving husband and father, smothers every spark of love in his bosom, and transforms him into a heartless wretch, and makes him steal the shoes from his starving babe's feet to find the price for a glass of liquor. It takes your sweet, innocent daughter, robs her of her virtue, and transforms her into a brazen, wanton harlot. The open saloon as an institution has its origin in hell, and it is manufacturing subjects to be sent back to hell. Additionally, Hart and Kaser note that opinions among middle-class, rural, Protestant evangelicals grew regarding concerns that the good and true life was being undermined by ethnic groups with a different religion and a lower standard of living and morality. In the wake of these concerns, the WCTU acted as protectors of the family by marching, organizing campaigns, raising money, and ultimately majorly influencing decisions to outlaw the sale of alcohol. Between 1907 and 1919, 34 states enacted statewide prohibition laws. Next, national prohibition came into effect on January 16, 1920. In support of prohibition, a famous preacher from the time, Billy Sunday, can be quoted saying the following: "The reign of tears is over. The slums will soon be a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs. Men will walk upright now, women will smile, and the children will laugh. Hell will forever be for rent." Moving forward, Hannah Griggs with The Atlantic notes that before Prohibition in 1920, conservative Protestants and the WCTU developed the Department of Scientific Temperance Instruction in order to push for a mandatory school curriculum that used scientific data to teach students about the physiological consequences of consuming alcohol. And they were successful. In 1884, New York became the first state to adopt this curriculum. By 1901, Georgia, along with 44 other states by this point, passed a scientific temperance instruction bill. So by the time prohibition was enforced on a national scale, there was already at least one generation of children who had already been educated on the WCTU-approved ills of alcohol. One could argue that temperance education may have had an effect on societal views that led to national prohibition. As noted by Monteith with religiousdispatches.org, WCTU-approved temperance education materials also often marked alcohol, opioids, and tobacco as damaging, morality-eviscerating substances. Rising panic about narcotics, coupled with temperance education, contributed to new anti-drug regulations in the 1920s and 1930s. The close relationship between anti-drug media, public opinion, and policy and law can be partially attributed to Richmond Pearson Hobson, who was an influential prohibitionist, short-term congressman, and a beloved Spanish-American war hero. In addition to anti-drug policies, Hobson also played a role in educating children about narcotics. Millions of American school children grew up in the 1920s and 1930s with Narcotic Education Week, using textbooks that emphasized how bad drugs could be for destroying morals, health, and respectability. Moving to more of a focus on public policy, Hart and Kaser note that the Harrison Act of 1914 was a law passed with the intention of taxing the opioid industry. This act was enforced by the Treasury Department's Narcotic Division, who would also be in charge of enforcing the national prohibition of alcohol. However, because the Narcotics Division enforcement of this tax law, their subsequent enforcement of the national prohibition of alcohol, and the interpretation of the Harrison Act by agents of the Narcotics Division, many agents believed their job was not only to prevent people from accessing alcohol, but also from accessing cocaine and opioids as well. 2 arrests of physicians from 1919 and 1922 marked the first arrests for non-tax related violations of the Harrison Act. In 1919, a Dr. Webb was arrested for the number of prescriptions he'd written in an 11-month span. In 1922, a Dr. Behrman was arrested for writing too many prescriptions to a single patient. As stated by Hart and Kaser, the Narcotics Division arrested about 75,000 people, including 25,000 physicians and pharmacists, between 1919 and 1929. These arrests and charges rapidly led to physicians being unwilling to write prescriptions for cocaine and opioids. This meant that there was no legal way to obtain these drugs, forcing users to either abstain or to seek opioids and cocaine in the illegal market, which exploded in response to the new Harrison Act enforcement approach. Additionally, users in possession of heroin, morphine, opium, or cocaine who could not produce a valid prescription were presumed to have obtained the drug illegally and were charged with violating the Harrison Act. Thus, the use of opioids and cocaine was effectively criminalized for the first time, not because that was the intent of the 1914 Harrison Act, but because of the Narcotics Division interpretation of it. Given this historical string of events from the establishment of temperance education to the unjust arrest of people who used drugs and doctors who prescribed them, Monteith notes it's possible that the Narcotics Education Week may have had similar effects on societal views and policies on drugs that temperance education had on prohibition. As noted by Monteith, Narcotics Education Week was taught until the late 1930s. One popular name in politics that grew up on Narcotics Education Week is Richard Nixon, who graduated in 1930. As many know, Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States. Robert Benjamin Abel from scholarworks.edu brings attention to Nixon's religious Quaker background, Quaker being a historically Protestant Christian denomination. Given Nixon's religious background, as well as the fact that he grew up with Narcotics Education Week, Monteith notes it's likely that Nixon was influenced by Hobson's work. This is best highlighted, as mentioned by Hart and Kaser, by Nixon's being attributed to declaring drug abuse as public enemy number 1 in 1971. And so, in conclusion, because of Nixon's religious background, his ties to the war on drugs, the presence of Narcotics Education Week in his schooling, and the opinions of drugs expressed in Narcotics Education Week, one could argue that the Christian temperance movement largely contributed to negative societal views of drugs and people who use them, as well as the societal presence of something called the moral model of addiction. The moral model of addiction, as described by Jennifer Grant and Joshua Grubbs with Science Direct, focuses on whether an action is morally good or bad, and also views addiction as a sin or the behavior/substance as an evil, as we saw in sermons from the late 1800s, as well as seen in the teachings of temperance education. Ryan Waters with ClarityChi.com notes these additional beliefs of the moral model of addiction. First, people who struggle with substance use make poor choices. 2, people who struggle with substance use lack willpower. And 3, people who struggle with substance use are unwilling to change their own lives. Despite clear societal views that addiction is a moral failing due to a lack of character or motivation, the condition is actually a genetic remodeling of one's reward circuit through epigenetic changes that cannot simply be willed away. With that being said, for the rest of this presentation, I'll be focusing on the role of epigenetics in opioid addiction. For anyone who is unfamiliar, the CDC describes epigenetics as the study of how our behaviors and environment cause changes that do not change one's DNA, but the way one's genes, or specific sections of DNA, are expressed and read. For context, chromosomes are located in the nucleus of each cell in our body. And these chromosomes are made up of DNA that is wrapped around proteins called histones. Specific sections of DNA, called genes, are read and made into RNA. And RNA is then used to make proteins. And these proteins will be used to decide the characteristics as well as the functions of our cells. And so gene expression, which is whether genes are turned on or turned off, which affects whether they can be read, is either increased or decreased based on how histones are modified. For instance, histone methylation is when a methyl group attaches to a histone and makes the DNA more tightly wrapped around the histone. This tight wrapping that methylation causes decreases gene expression, stopping the entire process. On the other hand, histone acetylation is when an acetyl group attaches to a histone, making the DNA less tightly wound, promoting gene expression and the entire process of making protein. So in short, gene expression decides how often or when proteins are created based on instructions from one's genes. These proteins then perform a wide variety of cellular functions. Now we'll move on to see if there are epigenetic changes associated with opioid use. And so, many epigenetic changes have been found to follow opioid exposure. One example noted by Brown, Godino, Salary, and Nestler with Biological Psychiatry Journal, histone acetylation has been found to increase in many regions of the brain's dopamine pathways. For context, these regions are known for their role in reward and addiction. So this increase of acetylation can be seen in the dorsal striatum, the nucleus accumbens, the locus coeruleus, and the central nucleus of the amygdala, among other regions. Histone methylation has also been found to decrease following opioid exposure. And this can be seen in regions such as the dorsal striatum, locus coeruleus, and central nucleus of the amygdala. These changes suggest that gene expression in these areas will increase following opioid exposure. Yet, since these findings are strictly correlational, studies that manipulated these specific epigenetic changes, such as histone acetylation or methylation, were performed on rats, and behavioral responses to opioids following such manipulations were examined. For the behavioral experiments, two methods were utilized. The first is called conditioned place preference, which is a form of conditioning. In this use of conditioned place preference, rats are placed into a cage or compartment, and morphine injections were administered on one side of the cage, called the paired side, while saline injections are administered on the other side, called the unpaired side. And after this administration, the amount of time a rat spends on each side is recorded. And if a rat spends a significant amount of time on the side associated with the morphine, it can be assumed that rat is seeking the morphine, also referred to as drug-seeking behavior. The second method is called locomotor sensitization. In this particular monitoring of locomotor sensitization, heroin or morphine was administered. Then, each rat's level of physical activity was monitored. If a rat displays increased levels of physical activity following the morphine, this is indicative of an increased drug effect. So, as a reminder, increased histone acetylation was found to follow opioid exposure. Therefore, these studies raised acetylation levels by removing enzymes that would usually decrease acetylation. As noted by Brown, Godina, Salary, and Nestler, these studies found that when acetylation was increased, morphine and heroin-induced conditioned place preference increased. Additionally, morphine-induced locomotor sensitization increased as well. As another reminder, decreased histone methylation was found to follow opioid exposure. And so, these studies lowered methylation levels by silencing the G9A enzyme that would usually increase methylation. When G9A was silenced or inhibited and methylation was decreased, morphine-induced conditioned place preference increased, and morphine-induced locomotor sensitization increased as well. Brown, Godina, Salary, and Nestler note that these findings suggest that opioid-induced increase of histone acetylation and decreases of histone methylation produce heightened behavioral responses to opioids. Sun et al. With the Journal of Neuroscience also noted that morphine-induced decreased histone methylation was also found to decrease the binding of several glutamate-related genes. These genes being GRIN2A, GRM5, and GRM8. This reduced binding resulted in increased expression of these genes. This is important because, as Brown, Godina, Salary, and Nessler note, enhanced glutamate-related gene expression has been found in people with heroin addiction. While Sun et al. Notes that particular glutamate receptor activation in the nucleus accumbens is known to play an important role in morphine-seeking behavior and heightened responses to morphine. Sun et al. And Brown, Godina, Salary, and Nessler argue that it's possible that opioid-induced downregulation of G9A, opioid-induced histone methylation, as well as the increased expression of multiple glutamate-related genes, as we saw earlier, GRIN2A, GRM5, and GRM8, all play a role in perpetuating opioid addiction. Finally, Wong and Fernandez note that alterations in gene expression can be long-lasting, can enhance an individual's vulnerability to drugs, including opioids, and can increase the risk of future drug use, thus creating a cycle of increased drug use and even further modifications to gene expression. As seen in the visual on the right, this can lay grounds for addiction and relapse. So, to summarize, opioid addiction cannot simply be chalked up to a lack of morals or character. There are complex epigenetic and biological factors at play that heighten behavioral responses to opioids, and these factors commonly make future opioid abuse more likely to occur. Moving forward, societal focus needs to be shifted from perceived downfalls of people who use opioids and other drugs. Views should be shifted to the role that our biology plays in addiction and relapse. Finally, the role of epigenetics in addiction treatment should also be used to determine if existing and novel treatments will be effective. Thank you. Please feel free to pause and look at any of the references that I used. This is page 1. This is page 2. This is page 3. And finally, this is page 4. Thank you again.